I'm a philosopher, and I would like to respond to an argument presented by Alex O'Connor in a formal debate that he had with Jonathan McClatchy, and I'll put a link in the description below for that debate. But it was an argument from divine hiddenness, and we will look at it in just a minute. But I want to respond to this argument because I think, first of all, Alex did an excellent job of presenting it, and secondly, the presence of God for me is by far the most fulfilling and important thing I've ever experienced in my life. So with that in mind, let's take a look at Alex's argument, and I'll play a portion of it, and then I want to respond.
There are, however, also people who disbelieve in God, not out of resistance or stubbornness or a hardened heart, but rather due to sheer lack of conviction. Indeed, many such people actively want to be convinced of God's existence and would jump at the chance of entering into a relationship with him if they thought that he did. But no matter how hard they search, they simply find no answer forthcoming from the heavens, and this is the non-resistant non-believer. Formally, then, Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness can be stated as follows. Premise 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists, and the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God. A loving
Alex then went on to use himself as an example, and I thought he did an excellent job, perhaps even a compelling job, of using himself as an example of a non-resistant non-believer. So his point was that non-resistant non-believers do exist, and if they do, then Schellenberg's argument has a conclusion that God does not exist. So just by way of preview, I want to just throw out a few initial thoughts, and then I want to present a counter-argument. So let's begin with some initial thoughts. Sometimes our assumptions about how God should reveal himself to us or should communicate himself to us can cause us actually to miss the real revelations that are there every day, right in front of our face. So sometimes our assumptions can get in the way of actually seeing or experiencing the call of God in this life. For example, my favorite description of God in the Bible would be, he's described as the Father of lights, from whom every good thing comes and every perfect gift is given. And when you think about this, if every perfect thing comes from God, of every good gift, he is actually the origin of beauty, for example. He's not just the origin of beauty, he is beauty personified. So if beauty were to make its presence known, or his presence known in this universe, what language would beauty speak, and how are we responding to that? God would also be the origin of justice, for example. So if justice were to make himself known in this universe, if there would be some sort of a call of justice, what language would justice speak, and how would we respond to it? Have you ever felt that somehow justice was being violated, for example? And what do you think about that? So my point is that we have to be very careful about assuming how we think God should actually communicate with us, because he might actually already be communicating with us, but not in the ways that we had expected. And there may be a reason for that. Now, when it comes to resistant non-believers, and Alex O'Connor would not put himself in that class, but we need to think about the fact that there's actually two kinds of resistance. There is the conscious, intentional resistance, which is quite obvious Alex would not be in that category. But then there's another kind of resistance, which would be an unconscious or subconscious resistance. For example, have you ever known someone who had an obvious major issue that they were totally oblivious to? They couldn't see it, but everyone else could. It was absolutely obvious to everyone, but they themselves could not see that they have a major, serious, let's say, psychological issue. Now, that's an extreme case. But if we can fool ourselves, or at least some of us can fool ourselves on not seeing some extreme cases that are obvious to everyone else, then the possibility arises that all of us, in large or small ways, are very good at fooling ourselves. And I would actually say, after years of interacting with many, many people, I've come to the conclusion that we are very good at fooling ourselves, but we're on a spectrum. We may not be on that extreme end of the spectrum, but we're somewhere, all of us, on the spectrum of being able to fool ourselves about at least small things. And that's why I always value the input of other people when it comes to their perception of what I might say, or how I might behave, or what my attitudes might be, because other people can often see these things better than I can myself. I might be very sincere in thinking that I'm not fooling myself, when in fact I'm pretty sure that I am, at least in small ways. One of the possible ways that we can actually fool ourselves is fooling ourselves into thinking that we're not fooling ourselves. And I realize at first you might just reject that as an example of gaslighting, for example, but I'm old enough now to know that I am probably fooling myself in at least small ways, at least in my perception of myself, and that's why I so value the input of other people in how they perceive me and how they perceive my attitudes and so forth. It just gives me sometimes a more objective look at things. And the third thought I just want to throw out there before presenting my counter-argument is that maybe God doesn't manipulate us. And at first that might not seem anything worth thinking about really, but we have a tendency, we grow up in a culture, in a society where we are unconsciously or subconsciously taught to manipulate one another to get what we want. Maybe not in large ways. There are some people who are serious manipulators, but all of us are constantly programmed to manipulate one another at least small ways to get what we want. Now, there's a very thin line, and I don't know where this line is, to be honest with you, between legitimate persuasion and illegitimate manipulation. But because we are immersed in a civilization, in a humanity that constantly manipulates one another, we're probably not even aware of what it would be like to live in a place where no manipulation ever occurred. And maybe, just maybe, God is not manipulating us. And if God is not manipulating us, then ways that we might expect God to reveal himself or help us to believe and so forth simply will not occur. They will be illegitimate, at least from the perspective of God. Just something to think about there. Now, maybe none of what I've really said is all that helpful because of our tendency to convince ourselves that we're not fooling ourselves. And even if we were fooling ourselves, how would we know? And I think there might be a way to begin to suspect that we might be fooling ourselves, at least when it comes to the call of God, by looking at how we actually respond to the call of God. So let me present my counter-argument here. And it goes like this. Proposition number 1. If at least one person actually experienced the call of God in human history, then God exists. Proposition number 2. At least one person in all of humanity has actually experienced the call of God. And the third proposition is just the logical conclusion of the first two. Therefore, God exists. Now, I use the term actually in the philosophical sense of it was real, it was true, as opposed to they thought they experienced the call of God, or they imagined that they did, or they dreamed that they did, or somebody convinced them that they did. Those might all be false experiences of God. I'm talking about an actual experience of God. So just to repeat the argument one more time, if at least one person has actually experienced the call of God, then God exists. Proposition number 2, at least one person has. Proposition number 3, or the logical conclusion, therefore God exists. Now, to refute that argument, you would have to show that no human being in all of human history has ever actually experienced the call of God, and that would be quite a project to embark upon. To defend that argument, all I would have to do is present at least one person who has. Now, in his argument, or in Schellenberg's argument, Alex O'Connor used himself as an example of a non-resistant non-believer. And in this argument, I could use myself as an example of someone who has actually experienced the presence of God and the call of God, and I've experienced it countless times in very powerful ways. But I'd like to go for something a little more challenging, and I would like to argue that it is actually you too have experienced the call of God, even if you consider yourself to be an atheist or agnostic. So let me suggest different ways how God might call the non-believer, and then you can examine yourself, ask yourself the question, how do I respond to these different calls? How hard do I have to work in order to explain them away or to deny them? And that's the key thing there. How hard do you have to work, or how often or how consistent are you in your attempts to deny or explain away these different calls, and come up with other stories to explain the call of God? So one, I might suggest, is nature itself. So God has said that he has woven his invisible attributes, eternal power, and divine nature into the very fabric of nature itself. So my question to you is, have you ever experienced a deep sense of awe, almost to the point of reverence, when observing something just amazing and beautiful in nature? That would be the call of God, according to what he said. He is calling you because of the invisible attributes, eternal power, and divine nature that he's woven in there. Now, you might mistake that for nature itself. Some people actually worship nature instead. Or you might come up with some sort of evolutionary creative story to explain why you feel this deep sense of awe and reverence sometimes. Let's say, for example, the last ski run of the day at the top of a mountain as you watch the sun setting down over the ranks of mountains. You might come up with a creative story to explain why it's not actually the call of God here as he described in nature, something else. But that would be telling. Here's another way God calls us, and it's the call of morality. So if God is actually not just the origin of truth and beauty and perfection, but truth and beauty and perfection personified, then the question is, what language has God spoken in this world? For example, have you ever felt that truth and beauty have been violated? There's some sort of there's some sort of standard of perfection and beauty that's being violated in this world. Have you ever watched the news and got this sense that something is being violated here? Have you ever said something that afterwards you knew, I probably shouldn't have said that, or seen something? So I throw that out as another call of God in this world, and the question is, how hard do you have to work to explain that one away? Because if you are working on it, then it's no longer non-resistant non-belief. It then moves into the category of resistant non-belief. And I would like to argue in the end, there are no examples in human history of non-resistant non-belief, who at least did not come to put their faith in God in the end. What about the call of justice? If God is the origin of every good thing given, what about justice? And what language does justice speak in this world? And have you ever sensed that there's some violation of justice occurring in this world? I'm pretty sure you have, but the question is, how hard do you have to work to deny that there is an ultimate standard of justice? Or maybe you create a just so story to explain how justice seems to occur to us, and how we seem to perceive violations of this imaginary concept of justice, which is imaginary in the end if we just create some sort of evolutionary scenario. Or maybe it's just a practical, pragmatic way we live. What about the call of our deepest cravings? So if I've In my interactions with people, I have noticed that there are some deepest fundamental cravings that we all seem to have. There's a craving for significance, that is, to be known and remembered. And it would be so nice if we could be known and remembered forever. What could possibly fulfill that craving? Well, maybe God can, and maybe he's built that craving within us as another example of the call of God to draw him to himself, to the only being who can fulfill those deepest cravings. In other words, I would say it's no accident that people have believed in some sort of supernatural ultimate entity throughout history in many different societies. It's the response to these deepest cravings. What about the deepest craving of value? We seem to want to be worth something and not just assign our own value to ourselves according to how we feel about ourselves. We want to have real value, not value that's contingent on what other people think about ourselves, our intellectual capabilities or lack thereof, our financial status, our fame, our power, our athletic prowess. We would really like a value much more stable than that, much more objective than that, and preferably the greater the value, the better. Now, what if there is a being who has an unquantifiable value and love for humanity? What if? And the third deepest, most fundamental craving, I think, as I've already suggested it here, is the craving to be loved, and I think we also need the experience of loving in return. And what if there is a being who is love personified? What if there is a being who's created this craving for love within us as a call to draw us to himself? And then I would suggest, and I'm not exhausting all the possible different ways God does call us, in ways we may not have expected, but then there's the personal call, and I would describe it as a deep unease. And I experienced this call right at the beginning of my life when faced with the possibility of experiencing God. There was a growing unease and discomfort that maybe this is it. Maybe there is a God. Maybe I do need to do something to respond to the call. So just to wrap it all up, I would suggest that ultimately all of us have experienced the call of God, and therefore God does exist, and there is no such thing as a non-resistant non-believer. But what do we do about this? And I would say you probably have to continue to think and ponder about these calls, and maybe even ask God, even if you don't think he exists, but if you do, help me see what's legit here. I don't want to be manipulated. I don't want to be talked into doing something. I want to imagine or fake a faith, so to speak. Many years ago, I worked for an aircraft company, and I was part of a group of engineers responsible for testing experimental aircraft engines, and I saw some of these engines explode in a test cell, about 3 of them, as a matter of fact. Now, since then, in the years since then, I have often flown on planes with those very engines on the wings, and I know that if they ever exploded, we'd probably go down. But I also know that we did a lot of tests and improvements so that hopefully that would not happen in production, in the commercial use of those engines. But when I get on an airplane today, I know that as an engineer, that there is no way that when anyone can say it's 100% certain that these engines will last until you get to your destination. But there is a point where I have to get on the plane, and once I get on the plane, I still don't know if those engines will last until I get to my destination. But once I'm on the plane, I don't worry about whether they'll pack it in anymore, because it's pointless. I'm on the plane now. And this is what I suggest we need to do if we want to truly experience God on a regular basis. That there comes a point where we think I do have enough faith to get on the plane, so to speak, to actually maybe put my faith in Jesus Christ as the one through whom I can have a relationship with God for all eternity, and then take that step. So how is that step taken? I like the way Jesus put it. He said, if anyone wishes to come after me, that person must deny themselves, take up the cross daily and follow me. For he who wishes to save his life will lose it, but the one who loses his life for my sake will actually find it. And he said, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. And the Greek word there means that you might have it in an extraordinary way. That phrase or that word to deny yourself in Greek means literally, according to the lexicon, to regard as unimportant, to disregard, to not pay any attention to it anymore. He's literally asking us, God is literally asking us to take everything that you think you are, your dreams, your ambitions, what gives you identity, what gives you worth, everything, and just set it aside in exchange for a life that he has to give us, a supernatural life, a whole new nature within you. Of course, that's a pretty big step of faith. It's like getting on the airplane, so to speak. But I can say, as one who has done that of all the wonderful things I've experienced in this life, in addition, of course, to the pain and suffering, of all the wonderful things I've ever experienced, by far the most amazing and fulfilling and wonderful thing I've ever experienced is the presence of God. So, to sum up, I would argue that there is no such thing as a non-resistant non-believer. Instead, every person who has ever existed has experienced the call of God in some of the ways that I've just laid out. But the real question is, how do you respond? How hard do you have to work to deny those things or explain them away? And I'll just leave that with you. My purpose is just merely to stir the pot of your mind, so to speak, with some thoughts that might be worth thinking about.